Let's move right into creating our first directive. This directive will be a user information card that we can drop anywhere on the page that will show information about a specific user. The first question we'll address is, how are we going to specify this directive? There are 4 different ways that you can specify directives with Angular. The first way, which you're probably very comfortable with, is specifying a directive as an attribute. You've already done that several times through the use of directives like the ngController directive, which is specified here as an attribute, or the ngapp directive, which is specified up here as an attribute. The second way to specify an attribute is by creating a brand new custom tag, such as this. These 2 methods for specifying directives are the most common and the recommended ways to use directives with Angular. There are 2 other methods you can use to do directives with Angular, but they are not recommended and typically only used when working with older versions of Internet Explorer. The first of those 2 methods is to specify the directive as a class, or to specify the directive as a comment. Either of these 2 methods will work, but as I mentioned, they're not recommended, especially because they're easy to overlook when reading HTML. Of the 2 methods which are recommended, attributes and elements, there's definitely a difference between the 2. Using an attribute typically implies that you're modifying an existing element, whereas using an element typically implies that you're adding some kind of a new object to the page. So for something like the user information card, it would be more appropriate to use a new custom element. Before we do that though, we're going to start out by creating our directive in the simplest way possible. So let's go back to our script file, and we'll specify a new directive. We do that by calling the directive function on our module, and then first giving it a name. And this function will return an object which describes the directive we're creating. At this point, we've created a valid directive in the most minimal way possible. This directive will do absolutely nothing, but it will be handled as a directive by Angular. Let's see that in action. We'll go back to our index.html page, and instead of creating a new custom element, I'm going to add a div tag with the user info card as an attribute. Notice that the attribute is specified differently than the name that I gave the directive in the script file. Back in the script file, you can see that the name was camel case, lowercase u, uppercase I, and uppercase C. But in the HTML, I've used dashes in between each of those different words. That's because HTML is not case sensitive. So in order to support the non-case sensitivity of HTML, the names of directives in HTML are specified using dashes in between the words. This is called dasherization or snake casing. There are alternatives to this method as well. You can also use colons, like that, or you can use underscores, like this. All of these methods are completely equivalent. Also, in order to support valid HTML, you can prefix your directives with an X or with data. You can also mix the use of dashes, colons, and underscores, and Angular will still handle the directive just fine. Of course, the most common way is to just use dashes and to not specify a prefix. Now let's see our directive in action by loading up the preview pane. We're going to use the developer tools in order to look at this div. And you can see that the div is there with the directive listed on it. Now, of course, our directive isn't doing anything, so let's start building our directive by giving it something to display. Back into our script.js, and I'll close the developer tools. We're going to add an attribute to this element called template. This attribute is a string that will display inside the element that the directive has been added to. So let's just write in user info card, and you can see that the text is now displayed. Now let's go back to our HTML and look at our directive again. Our directive is specified as an attribute on this div element. But of course, as we discussed before, a user information card is more appropriate as a custom element because it's a kind of component that you lay down on a page and doesn't necessarily modify an existing element, which is what an attribute implies. If we were to change this into a custom element by doing this, if you're using Angular 1.2 or before, then the text will have disappeared. If you're using 1.3 or later, then it will still be the same. The reason is that Angular has a default restriction for directives. In 1.2 and earlier, by default, a directive can only be an attribute. For 1.3 and later, the default is element or attribute. We can set the restriction specifically by going back to our directive definition and adding a new attribute to our object. This is the restrict attribute, and that's a string that will specify the format of the directive. If you want the directive to be an attribute, you specify a capital A, but if you want it to be an element, you specify a capital E. The other formats that we could specify are, of course, classes, which is a capital C, or comments, which is a capital M. Now, if you want your directive to be available in multiple formats, say as both a comment and as a class, then you could specify multiple formats together. Of course, for our directive, all we want it to be is a custom element, so we'll change this back to just the E. And our directive is now displaying again.